There is no continuous historical account of how Egypt lost control over its provinces in Kush and Nubia, but scattered clues occasionally appear in side notes within business and administrative documents. The last known viceroy who held real authority was Panesi, whose term seems to have lasted roughly through the first 2 decades of Ramesses XI's reign. His career appeared typical. He built a tomb for himself at the viceregal center in Aniba, as was customary, and his name also appears in religious texts at Bun. However, by the 12th year of Ramesses XI's rule, Panesi's name unexpectedly shows up in a routine document from the Thebaid, dealing with grain receipts from local farms. In that record, he is given a grand list of titles: standard bearer at the king's right hand, royal scribe and army general, overseer of Pharaoh's granaries, king's son of Kusha, and superintendent of the southern lands, the commander Panesi of Pharaoh's battalions. This strongly suggests that Panesi was either present in Thebes or overseeing its administration at the time. The question then arises, what caused his authority to suddenly reach into Upper Egypt? Panesi's time in office coincided with the final years of Amenalphis, the high priest of Amun. Amenalphis was the son of Ramesses Nakht, a former high priest who had served under Ramesses III around 70 years earlier. Ramesses Nakht appears to have secured the ability to pass his position on to his sons, a right previously held by the king. Amenalphis is first mentioned during the 10th year of Ramesses IX's reign, receiving honors for the many impressive monuments he had built for the Temple of Amun and for his effective handling of harvest taxes, dues, and labor contributions from temple staff. These accomplishments must have taken some time to complete, suggesting that Amenalphis began his duties well before the 10th year. Whether he continued in office under later kings is uncertain, though it seems likely that he did later in life. Amenalphis described a troubling episode in which someone, clearly an adversary, seized what seems to have been the temple of Amun and held it for 8 full months, during which Amenalphis suffered greatly. Eventually he prevailed over this enemy and appealed to the pharaoh for justice. This incident is almost certainly the same as one reflected in the court records from the trial of a gang of thieves during the 19th and 20th years of Ramesses Shi. The crimes included grave robbery and the theft of precious metals from portable shrines and temple doors, brazen acts that could only happen in a time of lawlessness. These offenses had occurred long before the trial. Many witnesses were children when the events took place and were adults by the time they testified. One testimony reads, "The barbarians came and took control of the temple, Medinet Habu, while I was tending my father's donkeys. One of them, named Pehat, captured me and brought me to Epip just as the violation of Amenalphis, then high priest of Amun, was reaching its 6th month. I only returned after the shrine had been stolen and set on fire, 9 months into the crisis that Amenalphis endured. The attackers came in large numbers." One witness recalled, "When I was a little boy, my father was killed. My mother told me that when the barbarian commanders killed him, they also took her for questioning." Panesi was directly implicated in the events. Another deposition stated, "I left the pharaoh's palace just as Panesi came and violated my master, though my master had committed no offense." Panesi's name appears elsewhere in relation to crimes committed in Thebes, including unlawful seizures and even murder. A strong argument has long been made that Panesi, the viceroy, led an occupation of the Thebaid, displacing the high priest by force, likely with the support of Kushite troops often referred to as barbarians. This occupation was described as a violation, a term that originally meant to cross a boundary or trespass, and later came to imply acts of damage, defiance, or disobedience. At one point, the conflict is even called the War of the High Priest, suggesting it may be connected to other events like Panesi's reported destruction of Hardé and references to warfare in northern Egypt, Lower Egypt, although partly drawn from legend. A text known as Papyrus Pushkin 127, written near the end of the 20th dynasty, speaks of the flames of war consuming all directions of the land. While this interpretation remains speculative, the motivations of those involved are even harder to determine. Was Panesi truly the aggressor and Amenalphis the victim? Or did Pharaoh have a role in this power struggle, perhaps inviting Piankhy to intervene in response to unrest, or possibly supporting Amenophis against Piankhy as one reading of a biographical account suggests? And who truly sparked the conflict, Piankhy, Amenophis, or another unknown figure? Earlier scholars believe that Amenophis's time in office marked a final attempt by the high priesthood, now wielding authority on par with the monarchy to seize control of the state from Pharaoh. While some contemporary texts show the high priest acting with arrogance, overriding official orders and denying rations to workers, these could simply reflect isolated incidents. In fact, the biographical statement published by Wendt depicts its author as a loyal servant of the king, more victim than villain. Given the limited sources, the following reconstruction offers a plausible sequence of events. Early in Ramesses XI's reign, a civil war broke out for unknown reasons. It lasted nearly a year and brought widespread looting and violence. Piankhy entered the Thebaid with Nubian forces, removed Amenophis from power, and temporarily took control. Not long after, Amenophis was somehow reinstated but died soon thereafter. His immediate successor is not known. Piankhy remained in control of the Thebaid until at least year 12 of Ramesses XI's reign, and possibly longer. He was still part of the royal administration in year 17. At this point, a new figure emerged, Herihor, likely of military background, who suddenly appears in Thebes as the high priest of Amun, carrying an impressive collection of titles. Heir, apparent, overseer of the two lands, great courtier across the entire country, field marshal of Upper and Lower Egypt, commander, superintendent of royal construction, administrator of Upper and Lower Egypt, overseer of granaries and vizier. Piankhy is no longer mentioned. Herihor had clearly become the pharaoh's trusted official, and even assumed the title Viceroy of Kush without hesitation. In year 19 of Ramesses XI's reign, likely following a divine oracle, the god Amun issued a proclamation appointing Herihor as governor in Thebes, while a man from the north, Smens, was named as officer in Lower Egypt. Whether these appointments were sanctioned by the king or carried out independently is unclear. Though contemporary accounts depict Ramesses XI as a largely powerless figure, he continued to visit Thebes for major religious festivals, and his authority was still acknowledged. Nevertheless, year 19 marked a clear departure from earlier times. A new era had begun, referred to by those living through it as the Renaissance. From this point forward, official dates used both the king's regnal years and the new era's calendar. In his daily role, Herihor maintained the title of High Priest of Amun, which served as the basis for his administrative authority. Among the people, he was casually referred to as boss or magnate. But within the sacred space of the temple, where tradition required the presence of a pharaoh to conduct rituals, Herihor took on the role himself, adopting full royal titulary and acting as king. By this time, the province of Kush had effectively ceased to exist. If Piankhy's intervention in Egypt had been an attempt to seize power, it ultimately failed. Herihor's new regime allowed no rivals. Piankhy was last reported fighting against Herihor's successor in Nubia near the end of Ramesses XI's reign. After that, he disappears entirely from the historical record. ***, by the start of the first millennium BC, the southern regions had entered a dark age. Although Herihor and his successors may have continued to use the title Viceroy of Kush to assert their claim over the former Sudanese province, this claim became increasingly symbolic and disconnected from reality. By the end of the 20th dynasty, if not earlier, inscriptions in the temples of Nubia cease, and evidence of any functioning administration vanishes. The last known texts at Kawa are linked to the Viceroy Tefnakht during the reigns of Ramesses VI and VII at Bun. The latest inscriptions date to the time of Ramesses XI, and temple rituals at Napata appear to have ended under Ramesses. 9. The last record of taxes collected from Kush appears late in Ramesses XI's reign. In year 23. Our view of the region fades completely after Piankhy's campaign against the rebellious Viceroy Piankhy. For several centuries, we are left with almost no archaeological evidence. This coincided with a period of low Nile floods, which led to famine in the Thebaid and forced communities in lower Nubia to abandon their homes and migrate south to the Dongola region. During Egypt's imperial era, the prosperity of lower Nubia had depended heavily on trade with Egypt. As Egypt declined economically and depopulation followed, the trade networks broke down, dealing a severe blow to Sudan. Both Egyptians and Egyptianized Nubians disappeared from the region, and the vibrant cultural life that once flourished vanished. The once grand temples built during the 18th and 19th dynasties were left deserted and crumbling, haunting reminders of a glorious past that would never return. The first signs of renewed prosperity in northern Sudan can be traced back to the early and mid-9th century BC, when evidence begins to point to a developing community around Napata. This site, located beneath Gebel Barkal, had once supported an Egyptian presence dating as far back as the reign of Thutmose III. The worship of Amun, the divine protector of the empire, had been established there and a modest shrine built. By the time of Tutankhamun had by then been expanded into a formal temple. Over time, the cult of Amun held a powerful appeal for the native Kushites. They embraced it as their own and began to settle in Napata, forming a permanent community. Around 890 BC, their burial site at nearby Kuru began to yield a series of large graves. The earliest of these followed native traditions. The tombs consisted of a pit and chamber beneath a simple mound, and the deceased was either placed in a crouched position or laid on a bed. Later developments saw the mounds faced with stone and the construction of mastabas, reflecting Egyptian architectural influence. At the same time, trade began to flourish once more. The Theban high priest Osorkon, in the 24th year of Tefnakht II of the 22nd dynasty, mentioned receiving fine gold of Kanhen the Fair and high quality, dry myrrh from the land of Naasi among offerings to Amun. These references align with the appearance of Egyptian trade goods in the Kuru tombs. But who were the people buried at Kuru? And what was the ethnic makeup of the Napatan community they led? For a time, speculation ran wild. Some suggested that priests of Amun had fled Thebes after the fall of the New Kingdom and established a theocracy in Napata. Others claimed that a man named Pashadbast, said to be a son of Pharaoh Shashank, had settled there and founded the Kushite royal line. However, there is virtually no evidence to support either theory. The worship of Amun at Napata had deep roots, and the jar-bearing Pashadbast's name was clearly a trade object, judging by their later depictions and names. The founding members of the 25th dynasty appear to have been an indigenous family of Black Sudanese origin, likely leaders of local tribes in the Dongola region. None of their birth names come from the traditional Egyptian name lists, and in colored artwork, their skin is shown as a deep chocolate brown, distinct from the lighter reddish-brown tone used for Egyptians. Their system of royal succession also differed from Egyptian norms. In Napatan tradition, the throne passed through the king's sisters, first from elder to younger brother, then to the eldest brother's son, the family of leaders buried at Kuru, likely the ruling class of what began as a chieftain enters. The historical record around 5 generations after the cemetery's founding, with a man named Alara, the first to be known by name. Notably, when this emerging chieftain decided to adopt a writing system, it chose Egyptian hieroglyphs. Though the local Nubian dialect remained the everyday spoken language, the rulers of the 25th dynasty used only Egyptian for official inscriptions such as triumphal stelae and public records. Indeed, the cultural framework of early Napatan society was heavily influenced by Egypt. Alara, by enclosing his name in a cartouche, clearly saw himself in the image of a pharaoh. When he and his successors sought to immortalize themselves in sculptures and reliefs, they turned to what was readily available, the Ramesside temples of Nubia. These temples, with their distinctive artistic styles, became templates for Kushite art. Later, when the Kushites gained control of the Thebaid, the dynasty embraced the traditional, bold artistic style of Thebes, marked by deep reliefs, powerful physiques, and prominent facial features. But more than art or language, it was The worship of Amun that truly captivated the Kushites and bound them spiritually to Thebes for over 2 centuries. Their political and religious power was centered at Napata, beneath the sacred peak known as the Holy Mountain, where Amun was worshipped in his local form as a ram deity. The kings of the 25th dynasty revered Amun with passionate devotion. To them, Amun alone could create a legitimate king. They saw themselves as his children and chosen ones. The Kushite monarchs closely identified with Amun in their royal imagery, and from the time of Alara they began dedicating their sisters and daughters to the god's service. Long before political ambitions came into play, the rulers of Kush likely yearned for Thebes with the same intensity that a medieval crusader longed for Jerusalem. Unfortunately, the early 8th century BC remains largely silent in the historical record, but it must have been during this time that the young Nubian kingdom was actively adopting and adapting pharaonic traditions that would go on to define the Sudanese civilization of the 25th dynasty, alongside the Egyptian script and language. Introduced perhaps by scribes brought from Egypt, came a range of technical knowledge vital to the South's eventual rise to power. By sometime before 750 BC, the Napatan kingdom had acquired advanced military technology, chariots, body armor, weapons, and most notably, siege techniques involving towers, ramps, and battering rams. These developments suggest awareness of innovations originating in Mesopotamia, likely transmitted through intermediaries in the Levant or Egypt. In this way, by the time the Kushite rulers emerged onto the world stage, they were prepared to challenge even the most powerful empires of the time. Alara was succeeded before the middle of the 8th century BC by his younger brother Kashta. Inscriptions bearing Kashta's name have been found at Elephantine, suggesting that his influence extended at least as far north as the First Cataract. With Kashta, the histories of Kush and Thebes begin to intertwine. If the Kushites had hoped to be welcomed by a unified Egypt, devoted to the worship of a shared national god, they were likely deeply disappointed. The Egypt they encountered was nothing like the powerful new kingdom of 6 centuries earlier. A foreign ethnic group had not only entered the Nile Valley, but had also taken control of the country. Egypt's resistance in the 12th century BC to waves of population movement from Libya and the Aegean met with only partial success. 3. Major battles fought during the 5th, 8th, and 11th years of Ramesses III. In the early 12th century BC, managed to stop the unchecked advance of these foreigners into Lower Egypt, but only just. These efforts were massive and left Egypt drained and weakened. Compounding the crisis were falling Nile floods and internal conflict within the royal family of the 20th dynasty, which further damaged the economy and undermined the state's ability to guard its borders. Throughout the late 12th and early 11th centuries, Egypt gradually lost control of its Asiatic and African territories. It was even forced to tolerate the settlement of the very Aegean groups that had once tried to invade, now establishing themselves at the doorstep of the eastern delta, particularly in southern Palestine. In the western delta, Libyan groups encountered no serious resistance. Tribes like the Meshwesh and, to a lesser extent, the Labu gradually migrated into Lower Egypt, where they became a disruptive presence among the local population. As warriors, Libyan tribesmen impressed the Egyptians and were accepted as mercenaries. The leader of the Meshwesh eventually settled in Heraclepolis, a city that had served as a military base since Ramesside times, and took command of the armed forces. Though this move was not a formal coup, Shashank's position as both head of the Meshwesh and top military leader paved the way for his rise to the throne after the death of Suzens. Around 931 BC, this marked the beginning of the Libyan 22nd dynasty, with its capital at Tanis in the northeastern delta. Despite their reputation as fierce fighters, the Libyan rulers rarely governed with strength or efficiency. They remained somewhat separate from Egyptian society, living on its margins and retaining their own names and likely their own language. Libyan soldiers were granted land as a means of support and probably owed feudal-style loyalty to their tribal leaders. Though they adopted Egyptian gods and intermarried with Egyptians at higher social levels, The Libyans continued to be viewed as outsiders, foreign and somewhat uncivilized. The Libyans' poor reputation was only made worse by how they treated Thebes. Although the Thebaid was spared direct Libyan occupation since the Mahaswan tribe, which had pushed southward during the 20th dynasty, soon vanished, the region still watched helplessly as its influence drained away and control of the high priesthood of Amun fell into Libyan hands. Typically, the high priest was a prince from the ruling 22nd dynasty, but many of them didn't even bother to reside in Thebes. Instead, they lived at the fortress in Tena in Middle Egypt, showing up in Thebes only for major religious festivals. Meanwhile, royal inspectors and tax collectors from the north roamed freely in Theban affairs, unchecked and unchallenged. After the dynasty's founder, there was almost no royal construction permitted in Thebes. A few local priests who rose to prominence dared to enclose their names in cartouches, likely imitating the earlier example of Herihor. However, these gestures led to no actual breakaway dynasty. The Libyan kings were known for their tempers, and anyone who opposed them could expect harsh consequences. After a century under Libyan rule, the grievances in Thebes had built up to a breaking point. Pharaoh Osorkon II may have sensed the growing unrest. During his Sed festival in his 22nd year, around 845 BC, he issued a proclamation meant to appease Thebes. I have exempted Thebes entirely. It is purified and returned to its true lord Amun. No royal inspectors shall interfere, and its people are freed for all time. But the gesture came too late. 17 years later, Thebes erupted in open rebellion against the reviled foreign rulers in the north. It was the third time in Egypt's history that the Thebaid had taken the lead in a nationalist uprising to overthrow a usurping power. Earlier revolts during the 11th dynasty in the 21st century BC and the 17th dynasty in the 16th century BC had succeeded in reunifying the country. No doubt the Theban rebels of 832 BC hoped for a similar victory. The revolt was sudden and fierce. Contemporary accounts noted that it had come without warning signs or omens. Soon the rebellion spread, and much of Upper Egypt had taken up arms against the king in Tanis. The uprising was accompanied by acts of vandalism. Temples and monuments associated with Libyan rule were defaced or destroyed. Theban scribes went so far as to destroy records and documents, aiming to disrupt the Libyan administration. Tefnakht II, the reigning monarch, responded quickly, but without much skill or control. He assigned the task of crushing the rebellion to his brother Osorkon, the high priest of Amun, who had remained based in Tena. With military support, Osorkon marched south, defeated the rebels, and re-entered Thebes without opposition. He then tried to restore order, though he issued 6 decrees to increase offerings and granted immunity charters to local institutions. Osorkon could not resist inflicting brutal punishment. The scribes and officials deemed responsible for the revolt were rounded up and burned alive, an act of retribution. As cruel as it was final. These harsh measures did little to solve the underlying issues. Just 4 years later, the southern revolt reignited and lasted for nearly a decade, this time sweeping across much of Egypt. Although the outcome remains unclear, Osorkon's account is biased and vague, clearly meant to present him in a favorable light. It appears that neither side emerged victorious. The Libyan dynasty remained in place, but Thebes was never fully subdued. In the aftermath, Libyan authority steadily declined and fragmented. The long 52-year reign of the ineffective Tefnakht III, which covered the first third of the 8th century BC, saw the rise of independent delta regions. These areas were increasingly controlled by local leaders known as Great Chiefs of the Meshwesh. At the same time, rulers in 4 major cities across the Delta and Middle Egypt began to claim royal titles for themselves. The Libyans' status as outsiders, combined with practical political needs and long-standing traditions, led to a shift in how kingship was understood. The idea of a single sovereign ruler gave way to a system in which multiple kings, each bearing the title of NSW, could coexist. These local monarchs did not wage war against one another or against the reigning king in Tanis. Instead, they maintained a fragile balance of power, each dating events according to his own regnal years. Still, This political fragmentation fostered a growing provincialism. Local cultures became more inward-looking, with a stronger emphasis on regional religious practices and tighter bonds between local rulers and their respective nome deities. From the perspective of the young Nubian kingdom, the situation unfolding in Egypt, their ancestral homeland to the north, was deeply disturbing. What they saw was not a land of reverence and divine order, but a chaotic and corrupted version of its former self. The devout traditions of the new kingdom had vanished. In their place stood a nation diluted by foreign influence, stripped of its fear of the gods and respect for sacred law. To the Nubians, Egypt had become a nation of mixed blood and moral decay, tainted by the presence of impious outsiders. The people no longer upheld the principles of divine kingship, nor did they care about being chosen by the gods. They were ignorant of how to serve the divine properly, and this ignorance didn't seem to trouble them at all. They broke religious laws in their everyday lives. Some even wore wool and ate fish, both taboo in the eyes of the devout. Around 737 BC, Kashta was succeeded on the throne of Napata by his son, known as Piankhy or possibly Pia, while earlier rulers like Alara and Kashta remain shadowy figures in the historical record. Piankhy emerges with a vivid and clearly defined character. This is due largely to the extensive and rhetorically powerful inscriptions he left behind, which offer a detailed portrayal of his reign and beliefs. Despite its rebellion, Thebes and the cult of Amun continued to play a significant role in the political landscape of the 8th century BC. Although it had failed to shake off Libyan control, Thebes, through its determined resistance, had severely weakened the 22nd dynasty and contributed to the fragmentation of Middle Egypt and the Delta. This made Thebes a power that others could not afford to ignore. In response, northern rulers and local chiefs sought to win its favor. One way they did this was by reviving an earlier custom from the 22nd dynasty, sending daughters to Thebes to serve in the priesthood of Amun as songstresses or ritual attendants. These girls were likely very young when they were dedicated, and their arrival was usually accompanied by financial gifts or political concessions, an effort to gain the goodwill of a city that had forced itself back into national consciousness. Ironically, although the Amun priesthood had lost much of its real power, it now found itself in a position to decide which northern ruler would be officially recognized in temple inscriptions. As a result, we find the names of various kings, some legitimate, others barely known, recorded in association with religious ceremonies or commemorative statues. Sometimes it was the reigning king of the 22nd dynasty, other times a little-known ruler from Letopolis, or a figure like Tefnakht of Hermopolis or even Harses, whose origins remain unclear. As the century progressed, Thebes showed a particular preference for one northern dynasty above the rest, the line of King Pedabast and his descendants. Pedabast, whose name suggests a Bubastite origin, led a dynasty that would later be designated the 23rd by the priest historian Manetho. However, the geographical reach and political base of this dynasty are still not fully understood. Manetho claimed Tanis as their origin, but excavations at that site have revealed little evidence of Pedabast or his successors. One passage from the Piankhy Stela suggests that around 717 BC, the dynasty's center of power may have been in Bubastis, with influence stretching northeast to Ranipur, west of Tanis. Still, it's uncertain whether this held true in earlier generations. The burial of a queen mother possibly linked to the 23rd dynasty at Tel Mokdam, ancient Leontopolis, has drawn attention to that location, raising the possibility that Bubastis and Tel Mokdam formed a political alliance or axis in the 8th century. Pedabast is indeed attested at Bubastis, though so are other figures from the waning 22nd dynasty, such as Pemu and Shashank IV. The inscription that mentions Pedabast might be interpreted as reluctant or ambiguous support for his rule. Pedabast and his descendants are somewhat better documented in Thebes. Not long after taking power, Pedabast was officially recognized by the priests of Amun, and his regnal years began to replace those of the 22nd dynasty for dating events. Among his contributions to the city, Petabast undertook the restoration of the 10th pylon on the southern side of the Amun temple complex, constructing a grand sandstone gateway to replace what had fallen into disrepair elsewhere in the temple. Precinct, Osorkon III, one of Petabast's successors, built a structure near the approach to the Temple of Khonsu. Its purpose remains unclear, possibly a porch, and the reliefs depict Osorkon alongside his son Tefnakht, who was serving as high priest at the time. Later in his reign, Osorkon officially elevated Tefnakht as co-ruler. This co-regency was commemorated in a modest yet elegant shrine to Osiris, located northeast of the main Amun temple, which Osorkon built soon after. Petabast also appears to have employed prominent Theban officials in his administration, which, based on contemporary descriptions, seemed broad in scope and relatively well organized. One of the most notable was Hori, described with elaborate titles such as Hereditary Prince, Soul Friend, and Fanbearer on the king's right hand. He held priestly roles in the service of Amun, Montu, and Napata, and served as Petabast's chief scribe and official correspondent. His responsibilities even included conducting an inspection of the kingdom's economic conditions. In an autobiographical account, Hori presents himself as a trusted advisor and powerful administrator. He claims to have guided the king, brought order to the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, and ensured the smooth running of the government. He speaks of being beloved by the king, reporting directly on national labor matters, issuing commands to the people while nobles remain silent, and reviving Egypt's traditions and legal systems. According to his own words, he was sent by the king to assess the condition of the entire country and restore it to order, assigning everyone to their proper role. While Hori's narrative is clearly self-glorifying, the core of the story is clear. Early in the 8th century, as the weakened rule of Sheshonq III of the 22nd dynasty faded and Egypt descended into disorder following the Theban uprising, Petabast took the opportunity to expand his influence. To do this, he ordered a kingdom-wide census and administrative survey, and to accomplish it, he turned to a well-regarded Theban official. Osorkon III maintained the strong ties with Thebes established by his predecessors. One of his key officials, Jekhonsfink, fourth prophet of Amun and overseer of the treasury of Amun, describes himself as someone trusted by Horus in his house, one who re-established borders and restored what had fallen into disrepair, who organized levies within the temples. He portrays a particularly close relationship with the king. When I was in the palace, I prospered there. I would enter first and leave last, discussing all matters of policy to guide him correctly. I understood the temples, redefined their boundaries, and secured their incomes. I spoke with His Majesty daily. While other officials said only what pleased him, I was unafraid to speak plainly. I calmed him when his temper flared, and he was satisfied with my words. I also brought him tribute from across the land. These remarks suggest Jekhonsfink had daily access to the king and was based entirely in Thebes. This supports the idea that Osorkon III himself resided there. In fact, Osorkon appears to have had a tomb built for himself on Thebes' west bank, and both his titles and artistic depictions connect him strongly to Upper Egypt, despite this evidence of real political involvement. The 23rd dynasty might have faded into obscurity if not for a significant development. Osorkon III's appointment of his daughter Shepenwepet as divine worshipper of Amun. This role, typically filled by a female royal, often a queen, was essentially that of a high priestess overseeing the women serving in Amun's cult. Though the position had existed since before the New Kingdom, it had never held major influence, always overshadowed by the powerful male clergy under the Libyan rulers. There's little record of this office, though a woman named Koromehu's name appears in a cartouches known to have held it in the 9th century during the time of the high priest and king Harses. But under Osorkon III, Shepenwepet transformed the role into one of real political power. She bore a double cartouche and royal-style epithets, such as God's wife of Amun, she who clings to the heart of Amun, beloved of much Shepenwepet, living in truth, reborn daily like Re. Shepenwepet even appears before her father in the first two rooms of the Temple of Osiris, making offerings to Amun, Reharkti, Ptah, and her royal ancestors. She's depicted being nursed by Hathor and wears the rare honor of two double crown symbols of supreme religious and political authority, asterisk. Osorkon's appointment of his daughter likely occurred shortly after his 23rd regnal year and was part of a larger political arrangement. As part of this plan, his son Tefnakht III was elevated to co-ruler. Iconography and inscriptions related to Tefnakht in the Temple of Osiris reflect a northern, lower Egyptian influence, suggesting that he served as Osorkon's co-regent in the delta, possibly at Bubastis. Meanwhile, the south was entrusted to Shepenwepet, who held a ceremonial role akin to a queen, alongside the obscure figure of Amun, who may have been her brother. Looking back, it's hard to believe that this arrangement ever stood a real chance of unifying Egypt. The final ruler of the 22nd dynasty, Sheshonq IV, though nominally recognized in Memphis, had little real authority outside of Tanis, his capital. Thebes entirely disregarded him. While his regnal years were occasionally acknowledged in official records, his name was pointedly excluded from major commemorative inscriptions, a clear sign of disrespect. In the Delta, the powerful local rulers known as the Great Chiefs of the Me maintained control over their respective territories and seemed largely uninterested in national politics. Although Tefnakht III might later have been revered by 7th-century elites as a noble ancestor, he made little tangible impact on Egypt's political scene. Unfortunately for Egypt, this lack of centralized power coincided with the dramatic rise of Assyria under its dynamic ruler Tiglath-Pileser III. In the west, Assyrian expansion meant the conquest and annexation of major buffer states like Arpad and Damascus, and the reduction of the territories held by surviving states in southern Palestine, such as Israel, Ashkelon, and Gaza, over the next century. These weakened states were expected to serve as intermediaries between Egypt and Assyria, a role they frequently failed to fulfill. The Assyrians, however, sought direct engagement with Egypt. After the fall of Gaza around 732 BCE, Assyrian forces advanced to the Brook of Egypt, establishing victory monuments in the region. A local tribal leader was appointed to monitor Egypt's frontier on behalf of Assyria, and strict restrictions were placed on Phoenician timber merchants, forbidding them from trading with either the Philistines or the Egyptians. All of this could be seen as a direct insult to a weakened Egyptian state, which seemed too feeble to respond. Yet, a reaction did come, one that would deeply shape Egyptian history for the next 4 centuries. Sometime shortly after 730 BCE, a Libyan leader named Tefnakht emerged in the western part of the Delta, in a region known as the West. In a somewhat murky move, he ousted Ankur, the legitimate chief of the Lebu, from his position in the city of Sais and took control himself. From there, he expanded his power to the cities of Buto in the north and Yamu in the south, uniting these 3 centers into what became known as the Kingdom of the West. By the 36th regnal year of Sheshonq IV, 728 BCE, Tefnakht had already adopted an impressive list of titles, including Great Chief and Commander, Great Chief of the Lebu, Prophet of Neith Ajo, and the Mistress of Yamu. Just 4 years later, following the death of Sheshonq IV, who appears to have left no heir, the 22nd dynasty came to an end after nearly 2 centuries of rule. During that same year, Tefnakht began work on a commemorative stela, though the project was never completed. The cartouches were left blank, and the inscription abruptly stops mid-sentence. This interruption may signal a turning point, as Tefnakht declared himself ruler and began dating official documents according to his own reign, effectively claiming kingship. Exactly how Tefnakht managed to rise so quickly to dominance in Lower Egypt remains unclear, but by the time Sheshonq died, he had already become a well-known figure. His sphere of influence stretched across the western delta, from Memphis to the Mediterranean Sea. Many of the major local chiefs and the ruling families of various royal cities accepted his authority. These included Akhenash in the Sebennytic region near the central Nile, though he may have done so reluctantly. Chief Sheshonq of Busiris, likely a distant relative of the last 22nd dynasty ruler. Chief Dedemunfank of Mendes, descended from the long-standing Hornict family. And Prince Bakenef of Athribis, a great-grandson of Sheshonq III. Even King Upet of Leontopolis and King Osorkon, four of the 23rd dynasty, who ruled in Bubastis and Ra-Nof, appear to have submitted to Tefnakt's authority. Their compliance, despite their own royal ambitions, may reflect Tefnakt's aggressive rise to power and his strong leadership. None of these regional rulers, entrenched in their local interests, stepped forward to claim national leadership after the fall of the 22nd dynasty. Tefnakt's growing fame and early victories seem to affirm Egypt's lingering potential. Even after centuries of stagnation, the memory of Egypt's power during the New Kingdom remained vivid across Western Asia, where tales of its mighty pharaohs were still told, though often in distorted forms. Observers who saw through the facade and recognized Egypt's underlying weakness in the post-New Kingdom era had few supporters, and the warnings of figures like Hosea or Isaiah went largely unheeded, with the Assyrian threat looming in Tefnakht. Viewed as a potential savior, it's no surprise that the remaining city-states of the southern Levant turned to Egypt for help. In 724 BCE, Israel, by then reduced to little more than the city of Samaria, sent emissaries to Sais and launched a rebellion against Assyria in hopes of gaining Egyptian military support, but Assyria responded swiftly. Shalmaneser V, successor to Tiglath-Pileser III, led his forces west and laid siege to Samaria. Before Tefnakht could intervene, King Hoshea of Israel was captured in early 722 BCE, and Samaria fell that September. Over 27,000 of its residents were deported. Shalmaneser died before the year's end, and Tefnakht seized the opportunity presented by the power shift in Assyria to act. He aligned himself with Hanno, the former king of Gaza, who had fled to Egypt a decade earlier to escape Assyrian conquest. Together they formed an alliance, and Hanno launched a revolt in Gaza. At the same time, uprisings flared in central Syria. The rebellion lasted 2 years until Sargon II, the new king of Assyria, turned his focus westward in 720 BCE and advanced into Syria. The resistance collapsed, and Sargon continued his march toward Gaza. This time, Egypt responded. Tefnakht assembled an army under the command of a general named Rhea and sent it to Rapahu, modern-day Raphia, just south of Gaza, where Hanno had gathered his Philistine forces. Sargon himself later recounted the battle. Hanno, king of Gaza, and Sib, the Egyptian commander, came out from Rapahu to confront me in battle. I defeated them. Sib fled in fear as soon as he heard the sound of my army approaching, and was never seen again. I personally captured Hanno. I then received tribute from Pyre of Egypt, from Samsi, queen of Arabia, and from Itamar the Sabaean, gold dust, horses, and camels. When writing the history of Egypt's foreign affairs between roughly 900 and 525 BCE, it's important to remember that much of the surviving documentation comes from sources outside Egypt. The battle at Raphia highlights the challenges this presents to historians. If Sargon's victory had truly been as decisive as he claimed, why didn't he continue his advance at a leisurely pace if necessary and subdue the delta towns one by one? The events that followed suggest that Sargon may have exaggerated the scale of his success. Although the battle was clearly a setback for the forces of Hanno and Rhea, it was not the total triumph that his account implied. In Egypt, Tefnakt's standing was barely affected. Between 719 and 718 BCE, he began consolidating and expanding his power in the Delta region. While his critics may have mocked his followers as dogs at his heels, such ridicule might just as easily have been aimed at the supporters of Egypt's earlier, now celebrated dynasties. The truth is, recent setbacks had not diminished Tefnakt's influence. Instead, he turned his attention toward Egyptian regions not yet under his control. With Memphis already in his hands, his next goal was Middle Egypt. Tefnakt's campaign southward was a show of strength. Of the two minor kingdoms that held sway over Middle Egypt from Asayat to Memphis-Namlut of Hermopolis aligned himself with Tefnakht. However, Pefjawabast of Heraclepolis refused to do the same. Despite this resistance, nearly all of Pefjawabast's fortresses, aside from his capital, surrendered to Tefnakht on both banks of the Nile. Tefnakht traveled through the region, moving up the Behr Youssef Canal and returning down the Nile to solidify his control. He then launched a siege against Heracleopolis itself. In desperation, Ptahwabas sent out pleas for assistance. Carried by the few still brave enough to defy the growing power of the Delta, this call for help would soon set in motion a series of events that would shape the next chapter of Egyptian history. The exact date of Asorkan III's death remains uncertain, but it likely occurred before Tefnakht rose to prominence, probably around 730 BCE or earlier. When the old king was laid to rest in his tomb west of Thebes, he left behind a vulnerable Thebaid under the leadership of descendants too weak to provide real protection. Tefnakht III, who was likely stationed in the north, did not outlive him. By much, in Thebes itself, another of Asorkan's sons, Amun, is mentioned in minor inscriptions. He lived long enough to father at least two daughters, one who married King Ptahwabas of Heracleopolis, and another who became a singer of Amun and was buried at Medinet Hago. Amun himself did not remain in power for long, though the exact details of his end are unknown. With Amun's disappearance, Libyan rule over the Thebaid effectively came to an end. Shortly afterward, in what appears to have been a peaceful and unopposed transition, the Kushite king Piankhy extended his authority over Thebes rather than resist his arrival. The people of Thebes welcomed this southern dark-skinned ruler who shared their deep devotion to Amun and honored their city. Piankhy installed a military garrison in Thebes, led by generals Porum and Lemersigny, but their presence was not oppressive. No officials appointed by the previous 23rd dynasty were removed from office. Even Shepenwepet I, the divine worshipper and a member of the former royal family, was allowed to remain in her position, continuing to enjoy the respect and recognition befitting a symbolic head of state. However, Piankhy did require her to make a key concession, one that would set a lasting precedent for centuries. She was obliged to adopt his younger sister, Amunirtis, as her daughter and designated successor in the role of divine worshipper. Both women were honored on public monuments with royal titles and regalia, with Shepenwepet maintaining only slight seniority over her Kushite apprentice. This clever arrangement gave Piankhy a firm hold over Thebes. Through Amunirtis, who symbolized Kushite interests and the military leadership of his generals, he ensured tight control over the Thebaid. It was from this region, now willingly aligned with Nubian rule, that the pleas for help from northern Egypt were passed on to Piankhy. Our main source for the dramatic events that followed comes from a large granite stela discovered in 1862 among the ruins of the Temple of Amun at Napata, now housed in the Cairo Museum. The stela is inscribed with 159 lines across its front and sides, topped with a vivid depiction of various dignitaries paying homage to the king. The text is a remarkably skillful attempt to use classical Egyptian, showing only minimal influence from the contemporary spoken language. It demonstrates just how far the Sudanese administration had advanced since the days of Alara, especially in their ability to employ educated Egyptian scribes. Although few Nubians of the time would have been able to read the text, the scribe responsible created a well-structured and rhetorically sophisticated narrative. He even included archaic expressions to emphasize his learning. Still, it's important not to assume he worked freely. Every element of the stela carefully serves the interests of the king. Piankhy, who spoke a different language, clearly supervised the creation of this record to project a specific royal image. Each part of the story, whether dramatic or subtle, is used to highlight aspects of the king's character. In fact, the inscription reads less like a formal record and more like a crafted story. It's not a typical chronicle or set of annals, it's a deliberate narrative meant to communicate a message. Through this account, we see a portrait of Piankhy exactly as he wanted to be remembered: bold, confident, and unshaken in the face of foreign threats, an uncompromising defender of divine will. He presents himself as a purist, outraged by the spiritual and moral decay of Egypt. His behavior and values stand in stark contrast to the corruption around him, positioning him as the righteous instrument of Amun's justice. Even in small things, his conduct speaks volumes. He instructs his soldiers on how to behave as respectful guests in Thebes, emphasizing purity and reverence. Only Amun deserves their worship. Only in his temple must they be unarmed and spiritually clean. Victory, he insists, comes solely from Amun. Piankhy follows strict dietary rules and keeps himself separate from women, traits that underscore his piety and discipline. Even though the motives behind the stela are clearly self-serving, there's little reason to doubt the general accuracy of the events it describes. While Piankhy's reasons for acting may have been idealized in the text, the actual events seem credible. His decision to intervene was clearly a response to Tefnakt's push into Middle Egypt, though the delay may have come from underestimating the threat, rather than the supreme confidence in himself and Amun that the text suggests. What truly pushed Piankhy to act was Hermopolis publicly siding with Tefnakht. At that moment, he ordered his garrison commanders in Egypt to immediately lay siege to Hermopolis, while also sending reinforcements from Napata. Somewhere along the Nile between Thebes and Asayat, the Kushite army encountered and defeated a rapid response force sent by Tefnakht. The next day, they wiped out the remnants of the fleeing troops across the river. This victory was seen as a major setback by Tefnakt's northern allies. Mamlet, who had been part of the siege of Heraclepolis, quickly abandoned the effort and rushed back to Hermopolis, just ahead of the Nubian forces who soon surrounded the city. At this point, Piankhy's commanders, especially Porum, demonstrated real military skill. While keeping Hermopolis under siege, they launched a swift surprise attack down the Bear Youssef and captured Oxyrhynchos. This clever move forced other rebel-held forts loyal to Heraclepolis to shut their gates and prepare for sieges of their own. The Kushite army was well equipped. They used battering rams against the city of Tena, capturing it after heavy fighting and causing significant casualties, including one of Tefnakt's sons, likely stationed there as commander. The victory sent a strong message, and the nearby town of Heboynu, modern Sharuna, surrendered without resistance. These rapid victories sealed Tefnakt's fate. Even if the stela continues for another 130 lines, mostly to glorify Piankhy, the text paints him as dissatisfied with his general's performance and slowly making his way north, not out of urgency, but so he could properly honor Amun, finish the mission himself. When Hermopolis surrendered, he personally received it and even expressed outrage over the poor treatment of Namlot's horses. As if he were an ancient version of an animal rights advocate, he then accepted tribute from Pheftawabist, the very ruler whose city he had come to protect. Pheftawabist bowed before him, pledged loyalty, and agreed to pay annual taxes. Piankhy, in turn, graciously accepted, adding a final touch of royal generosity to his carefully curated image.